My name is Dr. Jeremy Salmon and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the CIS, and it's my job to introduce tonight's speakers and set the scene for the discussion. I'm sure that many people here may have had a light bulb moment in recent times that made them realise that our universities, the key cultural institution in the formation of knowledge and the transmission of the values of the Enlightenment and modernity, were in trouble. For me, this moment has gradually come over the last year or so when I've been asked to comment by the Australian newspaper in a spate of stories about a range of social engineering initiatives across everything from early childhood to corporate Australia that are pushing what is now come to be known as the diversity agenda pertaining to matters of race, gender and sexuality. What has struck me about all these stories is that the agendas being promoted are not about the classical liberal or humanist principle, or dare I say it, even the Christian principle, that all people should be treated fairly and we should all treat people the way we want to be treated ourselves. What's been clear is that there has been an ideological agenda, not only telling people how they should behave in certain instances, but seeking to shape, set and enforce the boundaries of acceptable as opposed to offensive, racist, patriarchal or homo or transphobic thought and speech. What has struck me through this is the extent to which the precepts of postmodernism that were taking hold when I was an undergraduate 25 odd years ago, the extent to which these postmodern precepts have entered the mainstream under these various initiatives. Now, the postmodern notions that have taken hold revolve around the idea that the language used by the so-called dominant culture or the dominant discourse is what creates social reality and oppresses certain victim groups. It therefore follows, according to this logic, that it's fair to liberate marginalised groups by restricting or regulating freedom of thought, speech and action around a range of issues that are simply no longer up for debate, discussion and dissent. Yet debate, discussion and dissent are the foundations of the freedom of inquiry that universities should stand for as bastions of intellectual freedom. But not in the postmodern academy like Sydney University, Australia's oldest university. According to Sydney University's latest Unlearn marketing campaign, students will not be pursuing enlightenment while studying for their degrees, but deconstruction by being, and I quote, taught how to unlearn and challenge the established, demolish social norms and build new ones in their place. The Unlearning University promises not an education in how the world really works based on reason, logic and rational analysis, but an indoctrination in how academic ideologues with a one-trick agenda demand it should work. How it came to this and how we might learn our way out of the Unlearning University is the problem our distinguished speakers will address tonight. I'm going to introduce these each in turn before they speak. Our first speaker is Professor Frank Furedi. Professor Furedi is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in the UK. He is a sociologist, commentator, and the author of What Happened to the University, this book, which I believe is for sale outside. He's also the author of many other books on intellectual culture, the politics of fear, parenting and education. I'll introduce the other two speakers in turn, as I said. After our speakers have addressed us, we will then take questions from the floor and we aim to finish right on the dot at 7 p.m. So please welcome Professor Furedi to address us.
Right, good evening everybody, and thanks for inviting me. Jeremy referred to a light bulb moment. My light bulb moment occurred in 2002 when I was reading a memorandum that was sent by the Dean of Arts and Humanities of Durham University to his staff members. And in this memorandum he told people teaching humanities and liberal arts that they should not lecture on controversial and sensitive topics unless they had approval from an ethics committee. And they basically made the point that it was really not a good thing for lecturers to catch students unaware by raising issues to do with abortion or suicide or domestic violence or anything that was to us extraordinary. And I responded to this memo by writing an article for the Times Higher Education Supplement. And to my surprise, a lot of colleagues were saying, well, what's the big deal? You know, sort of, why should we worry about the fact that a dean in a good university, Durham University, tells lecturers to censor themselves and to reorganize their teaching material in such a way that it doesn't really offend the sensibilities of students. Now, that was a long time ago, and as it happened, the instructions were not implemented. It was too early then, and it would take another 10 years, another 12, 13 years, before what he asked became sort of seen as the convention in many universities. So what I like to talk about is what's happening and why. I think that very often critics of the problems in the university overstate the issues. I want to preface my remarks by saying that I don't think that there's a plot. There isn't a movement that is consciously driving these changes in the universities. If there was, it'd be much easier to deal with it, because then you can pinpoint who those individuals are. What we're seeing in the universities are the products of wider cultural forces that work themselves out according to their inner logic within the university environment. And secondly, I want to emphasize one point which is often misunderstood, which is the current zeitgeist on campuses that talks about safe spaces, that talks about trigger warnings, that has this imperative towards censoring anything that moves, does not represent the continuation of the radical moments of the 60s or what happened in the 70s. It is not simply another step in the relativist turn that took place in the social sciences in the 80s. It is something that has got its own origins, and it's quite distinct. It's quite clearly distinct from some of the problems and issues that were raised in universities in the past. I think that what we're seeing today is much more of a apolitical therapeutic turn, rather than the conscious sort of development of issues that occurred a long time ago. In my mind, the way that I understand it is that in terms of the issue of freedom, we've gone through several stages. I remember when I went to university, I was a student radical. I did my fair share of occupations and demonstrations, and played the role of a bad boy in my youth. So I know what student radicalism is like. And one of the things that I take away from the old days, or the 60s, 70s, is that whatever you thought about student radicalism, their sort of focus was expanding the realm of freedom. More free speech, not less free speech. More experimentation, not less experimentation. More risk-taking, not less risk-taking. In other words, this was a radical moment that perhaps had its limits and its problems, but it really wasn't a move towards censorship. It didn't have that kind of puritanical, censorious impulse that is very much the feature of student political radicalism. I wouldn't even call it radicalism, but student political protest at this stage in time. And in my mind, the way that I see it is that as far as freedom is concerned, we've gone through three phases. In the 60s and most of the 70s and even the early 80s, people on campuses, to a person, would all sign up to the fact that academic freedom was inviolable and that free speech was a value well worth fighting for. So at that point in time, freedom of speech was seen as untouchable, something that you would fight tooth and nail to protect. Somewhere along the lines, around the turn of the century, around 2000, a little bit before, maybe a little bit after that, this notion of freedom shifted to what I call, I believe in free speech, but. And what really counted, what really mattered was the but. And everybody had their sort of reason as to why, in this case, free speech was not allowed. Or, yes, I believe in free speech all the time, but these people are so insensitive, they are so provocative, they are so offensive, that in this case, we need to have a different standard. We have to apply a different standard in the way that we approach their orientation towards speech. And then, from the free speech, I believe in free speech, but we get to the current state, where for the first time in modern times, really the first time since the Enlightenment, you have significant groups of academics and students, they're still a minority, but they're quite significant because of their influence, who actually argue that free speech and academic freedom is not a big deal. Why the fuss? Why worry about it? Who cares? There are more important things in this world than academic freedom and free speech. And not only do they say that free speech is not a big deal, but what you're also getting is a significant number of people in the academy who argue that actually, when you come to think about it, free speech is often used as an instrument of privilege, that free speech is often used by the elites in order to oppress the rest of society, totally inverting reality, totally forgetting that it was people from below who struggled for freedom of speech, that freedom of speech was never a gift given to society. It had to be wrested from the elites in previous times. But the way they kind of present it is that free speech is really the privilege that's exercised particularly by white heterosexual males who somehow have got this weird notion that this is something that is well worth cultivating. And that's a very important development, and we're now having numerous surveys being carried out, particularly in the United States, where in many places, 38 to 45% of the students, when asked what do they think of the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to free speech, when they are asked what they think about academic freedom, answer, I don't know, who cares? What's the big deal? So that's a totally new kind of development that has occurred. And in my mind, in my book, the way that I explain this is what we're seeing on campuses is an interesting development, which I call the freedom-security trade-off. What I mean by the freedom of security trade-off is this. Historically, authoritarian governments argue that if you give up a bit of your freedom, will make you more secure, right? You know, you'll have less freedom to move and to talk and to engage with other people, but you'll be more secure. We'll protect you from all the evil things that are outside. Now, you and I know that when we give up our freedom, we never become more secure. But nevertheless, that's the argument that's used. Now, on campuses, what we have is the academic version of the freedom-security trade-off. And the academic version of that basically says that it's well worth giving up a tiny bit of freedom in order to protect students from insensitive remarks. It's really important that we limit freedom to just simply talk about sensitive subjects because it might offend students. And what you have is this new notion, this new idea that it's entirely legitimate to constrain the terrain of freedom in order to immunize young people from the horrors of criticism, from the horrors of offense, from the horrors of being challenged and judged, particularly judged in their everyday life. I think you probably know, if you live near a campus or if you work on a campus, that one of the core values of all universities in Australia, as much as in England and America, is non-judgmentalism. I mean, it's in their mission statement. I just think about it. Our core value is non-judgmentalism. Now, in a civilized world, we presume that we judge each other all the time. I mean, the very idea of tolerance is based on the idea that I think your ideas are really horrible. That's what my judgment is. But nevertheless, you have the right to express them. As Hannah Arendt said once, without judging one another, we don't take each other seriously. Without being able to judge each other, there is no such thing as a public debate and a public dialogue. And yet we have come to the point where non-judgmentalism is celebrated as really the most important value. And American universities have these mission statements on their web pages. Come to our university, and we're not going to judge you. Wow, I'm going to go to this higher education environment, and I'll be completely quarantined from judgment. Isn't that great? And I think that kind of attitude has become very much internalized in the way that these universities work. Now, it seems to me that what has happened with freedom is that it's become subservient to three important values. The first value is that of diversity. And diversity is seen as being the principal values at the moment, and diversity trumps anything else. When you actually scratch the surface, diversity is one of those empty concepts. It doesn't mean anything. Right? When you look at diversity, and there might be some diversity trainers here, there are more diversity trainers than rats these days, you will find that when you ask what diversity means, they're not able to explain it. Because in English, diversity means the many. Well, that's like an empirical fact. It's not a value, it's an empirical fact. After diversity comes safety and security, and every university advertises that it's a safe space or it's a safe university, and the safety of the student is their greatest concern. And thirdly, the third value is the right of not being offended. That's the three values that are being upheld. Now, why has, and I just want to spend a bit of time on this before I conclude, why has the right not to be offended become sacralized? I mean, where does that come from? That all of a sudden, to be offended is almost like a form of irredeemable crime. And it seems to me that what has happened is that in our world, in the Western world, we've created a form of socialization, excuse me, through the way we parent children, through the way we school them, that young people are socialized into a mode of validation. Instead of getting young people to engage with values about what is right and what is wrong, instead of communicating the values that the parents were socialized into, increasingly we live in a world where children are socialized by raising their self-esteem, by telling them how bright they are. They come home from school with 10 smiley faces. They're all told that they're little Einsteins. And throughout school, all the way through high school, what happens is that they become immunized from criticism. I remember writing about this in The Australian a few years ago when, I think in one of the school districts in Australia, they banned the use of red pens in kind of schools on the grounds that it was a form of violence. I don't know. I don't know how they think and what kind of drugs they're on, but the very idea that somehow if you somehow kind of cross something out with a red pen is a form of violence is unusually weird. But it basically indicates that there's an impulse, an imperative, where you see that it is your role to validate rather than to question and to criticize. Now, if that's the education that you've had, if that's how you've been socialized, it's not surprising that when you get to university, you will be looking for security. You will be looking for safety. It's not surprising that a large percentage of American students, for example, actually invite a paternalistic reaction to their predicament. From their point of view, they want to be looked after. It's an interesting development. I mean, I'm looking around, and there are a few people who are almost as old as I am, and there are people here who are maybe 20 years younger, 30 years younger. So you would remember that there was a time, not so long ago, when you went on campus as a student, and your parents were not with you. I mean, do you remember arriving on campus, and you said to yourself, great, mom and dad are back there. Thank God for that. If they were here, it would be social death, as far as I'm concerned. And that was the end of the matter. Well, you come to my university in England, and again, I mean, there are more parents than rats. I mean, you go anywhere on the first week, and there's mom and dad, and sometimes grandparents come as well, just to give a bit of backup to the parents, because it's such a difficult transition. And in some universities, they even have transition counseling. They counsel students about the fact that you're now in a university. It's a big deal, and you might be insecure, and you might have all kinds of mental health issues. And the problem is that if young people are socialized into this therapeutic way of engaging with the world, then it's not surprising that they will feel mentally insecure, that they will feel very often a need to be immunized from the pressures and challenges of life. We've created a problem. They're not responsible for that. And the unfolding of this dynamic in universities, I think, is what we're seeing when we see trigger warnings and all the demonstrations to be protected from Trump being elected. I need counseling for the next 2 years because all these things that you've seen are very much the reflection of that and the consequences of that. So therefore, what we have today is the presumption that students are simply biologically mature children, and they needed to be treated like that. And if you treat students as biologically mature children, then they will behave in accordance with the kind of definitions that we've endowed upon them. And it seems to me that that is really the main problem that we're confronted with. I don't want to go on, and if I was giving a longer speech, I would talk about identity politics, which I think is the obverse side of this, because identity politics today is no longer what identity politics was in the 70s. You know, for example, the movements for gay marriage today has got nothing to do with gay liberation movements in the 60s and 70s, which are completely different in their dynamic than the ones that exist now. All the identity movements of the past had a completely different political edge to the ones that exist now. The identity movements of today are basically based upon one single principle, which is it's all about me. It's all about me. And if you don't believe me, go on a demonstration, go on a protest. And you go on a protest, and what you see is that everybody's taking selfies of themselves. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. There are 5,000 people on the streets, and they're there for the picture. You know, not the T-shirt even, just a picture. And that becomes like their way of saying that I was there, I did the business, and it's really all about me. And when it's all about you, then identity, your identity becomes so important that if I criticize you, if I say you're wrong, right, the way you interpret the fact that I say you're wrong is not that your ideas are wrong, but that somehow I'm attacking you as an individual, that I'm diminishing your humanity. And that's the reason why we get these sort of hysterical scenes on university campuses all over the Anglo-American world. What we need to do, we can discuss later, is fairly clear and fairly straightforward. It's just simply to stand up and be counted and use our humor, our sense of humor, to demonstrate that there's a different way of running the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I could have added before that Frank is a long-term friend and visitor to the CIS, and we're very happy to have him back. Which brings me to Professor Marguerite Johnson, who is appearing for the CIS at the first time. We're very glad that she could accept the invitation to address us. Professor Johnson is an author, researcher, and associate professor of ancient history and classical language at the University of Newcastle. Professor Johnson is particularly interested in the ongoing dialogues between antiquity and modernity and holds a keen interest in various facets of the humanities. Earlier this year, Professor Johnson discussed Monash University's introduction of a more formalised implementation of trigger warnings and holds concerns for what's next. I think she's still employed, but we might find out more. Please welcome Professor Johnson.
Thank you. As Jeremy said, I'm a classicist, and I think it's appropriate I begin very quickly with a classical anecdote. In second year at university, I had a very important moment, important pedagogical moment, learning moment, when my professor was teaching Plato's Republic. And he was discussing ideas of censorship, and he retold us the story of the cave, which had a profound effect on me as a young woman. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story of the cave in the Republic, there is a description of people who live in a cave and their only sense of reality is the shadows on the wall. And they're basically trapped down there, and they watch the shadows on the wall. And the way this was taught to me was in terms of freedom of speech and censorship, because if you live in the cave and you watch reality as shadows on a wall, the day comes when you're liberated from the cave, and how on earth are you able to cope with the reality, because it's far more devastating and amazing and beautiful than mere shadows. So with that in mind, it's always stayed with me. I want to talk about issues that have confronted me now, not as a young undergraduate, but as a very old academic who is still teaching classics. As a cultural historian of the ancient Mediterranean, whose teaching and research involves sort of confrontational subjects, my areas are ancient sexualities, ancient genders, ideas of eros and amor and eroticism in the Greek and Roman worlds, the roles of women, the roles of violence. I have, for a very long time, before it was sort of a current sort of topic of pedagogical and political obsession, used basic content warnings in my course guides. I won't use the term trigger warning. I think that has become so politicised as to now be rendered redundant. Trigger warnings are also consistently used in the wrong context. They are specifically applicable to people who have post-traumatic stress syndrome and may be triggered by certain images. It's very different to providing course material on ancient sexualities or modern sexualities, where I provide a basic content warning to say, if this course is not for you, then I suggest you do something else. So these warnings, if you want to use the term warnings, are at my discretion and as an experienced teacher and an expert in the field. They're designed to signal to the undergraduates, as I said, that my courses will contain confronting material. They are listed on the front page, and this is all that I do. I don't fetishise it. I don't go on about it. I don't preempt my students' responses to material. That is up to them. And I certainly don't patronise my students or feel that I need to maternalise them. What I want to do with my students is to place the onus on them. They've chosen to enrol in a course, and my courses are usually very unambiguous in their title. Sex and Scandal and History should tell you what it's about, as should Ancient Sexualities. Course descriptions are always widely available online, and so anyone can tap into any university and read a course description before they decide to enrol in it. These sorts of statements may seem like, stating the bleeding obvious, but I find now that it is something that one needs to do. I want to place the onus on the students because university is about knowledge, and knowledge is also about, knowledge is not pleasant. It's always beneficial though, not only to the individual but to the community. And that is a very basic statement of the bleeding obvious. But as I said, I think we're heading into a contested period of academic inquiry and teaching. The onus is also on the individual student because university is about preparing you for life, for leaving the cave and forgetting about the shadows on the wall and experiencing life firsthand. And it's also about instilling a love of the liberal arts and the humanities, which is also about empathy, agency, contribution, sacrifice and service. These should be aspirations. Aspirations to contributing to the achievement of communal goals, not serving a Western cult of the individual. So that's my experience, and I want to also now move on to what is happening around us at the coalface of the universities, where trigger warnings really are so frequent, as I said, as to become somewhat redundant. I would like to say to people who consistently suggest that people like me use trigger warnings is that the more order that's implemented, the more order needs to be implemented. By ordering, formalising, codifying a system of trigger warnings at any tertiary institution, more power is handed over to governing bodies and more academic freedom is threatened. I would oppose my courses being vetted by a governing body for the purposes of assessing them for trigger warnings, and that was the sort of topic that was very much at the forefront of the media earlier this year when Monash did begin to explore formalisation of trigger warnings and reviewing content of course material. I would oppose my courses being vetted, as I said, because not only because I believe I know best, and I do believe I know best, but it's because I would be subjecting the course material I teach and research to a governing body that may not be wholly objective to what I am doing. Knowledge is precious, but knowledge is also vulnerable. It's vulnerable to moral judgments, including religious judgments. It's vulnerable to the judgments of those who advocate extreme forms of political correctness, which equate in some instances, particularly in the work that I research and teach, to censorship. It's vulnerable to economic rationalism. It's vulnerable to the media. And in the case of the last 2 points, certain knowledge can be erased because it may be seen to be contributing to falling enrolments, negative student surveys, institutional financial losses, and someone in the classics really needs to be very much aware of those sorts of issues. So there is sort of practical responses to what is going on around us at the moment. I think about why I have put content warnings in for a long time. And the reason that I do it is partly because I can never, if I were looking out at a sea of students right at this very moment, I am not to know that one person in my class has not been raped. And just a basic content warning out of the respect for that dignity of that human being is something that, as a feminist in particular, I feel that I need to honour. Moving on, though, to what I regard as trigger warnings getting out of hand, and this is what frightens me. And as Frank said, there is no one sort of agenda, no political imperative and organisation that you can sort of point your finger to and say, this is, for want of a better phrase, the enemy. This is the group who is organising it, because it's fluid and it appears in different guises. But the internet, as we know, is the source of all information. And I did some sort of quick surfing online prior to this, and I wanted to title this section of my talk before I begin to wind up with the following. You say tomato, I say tomato. One person's trigger warning is another person's pet. Once an entity, such as a trigger warning, has become materialised, there is the threat of a snowball effect. Any quick search on the internet reveals that one person's trigger warning is another person's pet. And I will give you a list for an example which suggests what should be labelled when you're lecturing, what topics require a trigger warning. This is a direct quote. I begin. Swearing, rape, abuse, physical, mental, emotional, verbal abuse, child abuse, pedophilia, self-injurious behaviour, self-harm, eating disorders, etc. Talk of drugs, talk of drug use, legal, illegal, or psychiatric, suicide, descriptions, pictures of medical procedures, even if they don't contain blood or gore, descriptions, pictures of violence or warfare, including instruments of violence such as knives or guns, corpses, skulls, skeletons, needles, discussions of isms, shaming or hatred of any kind, racism, classism, hatred of cultures, ethnicities that differ from your own, sexism, hatred of sexualities or gender that differ from your own, anti-multiple, non-vanilla shaming, sex-positive shaming, fat shaming, body image shaming, neuroatypical shaming. Any time slurs are used in your class, this includes words like stupid or dumb, which are still widely considered to be socially acceptable, trans, degendering or anti-trans views of bodies, dismissal of lived oppressions, marginalisation, illness or difference, kidnapping, be it forceful deprivation, when it's kidnapping not, of disregard for personal autonomy, discussions of sex, even brackets, consensual, death or dying, spiders, insects, snakes, vomit, pregnancy, childbirth, blood, serious injury, trypophobia, which is phobia of irregular patterns, or clusters of small holes or bumps, scarification, Nazi paraphernalia, slimy things, anything that might inspire intrusive thoughts in people with OCD. End quote. This list, which was the first of the search results that appeared on Google, covers the entire cohort of disciplines taught at universities, from history, media studies, dietetics, medicine, nursing, engineering, architecture, biology, and the list goes on. Not one for hysteria or catastrophizing, I find myself as an academic and teacher close to a mild panic. The list is also testimony to an arrogance of entitlement and lack of empathy that is characterised by an absence of self-awareness. That list infuriated me. In categorising and formalising a list of topics deemed worthy of trigger warnings, the authors have conflated, and I say, how dare they, rape and child abuse and pedophilia with talk of drug use, legal, illegal or psychiatric, spiders, insects, snakes and vomit. And if we are not mad and angry, I ask, why are we not? The Network of Women Students Australia has a more comprehensive list, including flashing lights and food, and they place these also in the same list as rape and child abuse. I would suggest rather strongly that there is a problem here, and again, not one for hysteria or catastrophising. I find myself as an academic close to hysteria. The conflation of the horrendous with objects and topics that upset some individuals is testimony to identity politics gone mad, and the inequitable championing of individual self-esteem at the cost of objective delivery of knowledge for the benefit of the group or the community. The lists also speak to the self-selection of the so-called advocates who see it as their inalienable right to speak on behalf of others, including minorities, the dispossessed, and in so doing perpetuate the practice of rendering such groups and individuals without agency. Taken to its most logical end, if one were to apply the logic, a term I use wisely, is to organise social mechanisms to put trigger warnings on billboards, all forms of advertisement, music of all genres, Twitter feeds, Facebook feeds, television, doctors' surgery, dentists, zoos, supermarkets, places of worship, hospitals, parks and recreational facilities, funerals, funeral homes, art galleries, museums, radio stations, public transport, veterinarian clinics, animal shelters, fast food outlets, restaurants, all news services, libraries, excavation and public work sites, documentaries, historical commentaries, bars and educational institutions. Only then, surely, would individuals feel safe and validated and protected, or they could stay in Plato's cave watching shadows on the wall. What particularly incited me to begin to sort of engage in this academic environment about trigger warnings and what's happening to the universities is partly my own research. As a classicist, one of my main research areas is Ovid's Metamorphoses, a very, very controversial text in the 21st century, and one that is now the target of cries for abolishment, to have it removed from syllabi, particularly in the United States. Ovid, in fact, ironically, was sent into exile for writing material by the Emperor Augustus, which I find incredibly ironic. I want to end not with Ovid, though, but with Oscar Wilde, who wrote, and Ovid would have appreciated this, I feel, "The books that the world calls immoral are the books that show the world its own shame." Thank you.
Thank you, Marguerite. It's all right. Our third and final speaker will be Professor Stephen Schwartz. Professor Schwartz is a senior fellow at the CIS and a board director at several companies, including ACARA and Teach for Australia. Professor Schwartz is the author of 13 books and has served as Vice-Chancellor and President of 3 universities, Macquarie and Murdoch Universities in Australia and Brunel University in the UK. He has served as the National Chairman of the Fulbright Commission and is also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, Royal Society Exchange and NATO. I invite Professor Schwartz to address us.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Particularly for that introduction, it's more than I deserve, and to tell you the truth, it's more than I'm used to. When the announcement of my retirement was made at Macquarie University, I was walking across the campus and I encountered a well-known science professor, and she came rushing up to me. She said, "I've just heard this news. You're leaving. This is terrible." And I said, "Oh, don't worry. The University Council will search far and wide, and I'm sure they'll find a really good person to be Vice-Chancellor." And she said, "Oh, sure, that's what they said the last time." So you can see how I'm used to you, academic. A trigger warning for all of you. I might say that someone's stupid, but I'm not sure yet. I've got to get this out of the way. When I was Vice-Chancellor of Macquarie University, I received a letter, an irate letter from a member of the public. And he wrote to tell me that there were Macquarie academics who were spreading they were distributing what he called pro-Palestinian propaganda on a publicly available website. And he and some of his friends found this irksome, and therefore it was incumbent upon me as Vice-Chancellor to make them stop. In other words, to shut them up. On investigation, I found that there were indeed university academics who were writing articles about Middle East politics and making them available on a public website. As it turned out, the website did not actually belong to the university, but as I wrote to my correspondent in reply, it wouldn't matter if it did. I wouldn't be able or willing to do anything to make them stop. This is what academics do. They write articles in their area of expertise, they make them publicly available so others can read them and comment on them and discuss them. Disapproval alone is not grounds for silencing these academics or anyone else for that matter. It doesn't mean that I endorse what they say. It doesn't mean that the university endorses what they say. In fact, the university doesn't have a foreign policy. But in a phrase that's often misattributed to Voltaire, we would defend their right to say it. I offered to invite my correspondent or one of his friends who had expertise in Middle East politics to come and speak on campus. But even as I was writing the letter and sending it, I knew this was not the reply that he expected or hoped for, and I was right. I soon received a copy of a letter that he had written to the Federal Minister for Education, asking her to intervene. Now, you would have hoped that the Federal Minister of Education would have responded with a robust defense of freedom of expression in general and academic freedom in particular. You would have hoped. But you would have been disappointed. Rather than mount a spirited defense of academic freedom and freedom of speech, the federal minister decided to sidestep the whole issue. She wrote back and said that she couldn't do anything about it because universities are under the jurisdiction of the state government and she's a federal minister. So my correspondent and I shared a few more desultory exchanges, each one shorter than the one before, until he eventually suggested that I go forth and multiply, but not exactly in those words, and that was the end of the matter. Now, I've received many similar correspondence and very many similar requests over the 16 years that I was Vice-Chancellor. They came from politicians, from business executives, from community leaders, from parents, and as Frank pointed out, they almost always were written in the same way. They would say, I believe in freedom of speech, but, and the but, of course, is what counts. I drew the conclusion that everyone in the world is in favor of freedom of speech in the abstract, but they cannot resist calling for censorship whenever someone is saying something that they don't want to be expressed. But of course, that's the only time it actually counts, isn't it? Freedom for an idea to be expressed, an idea that you actually despise, that you actually hate. That's when freedom of speech actually counts. Now, vice chancellors are still getting these complaints, but something profound has changed over the years. My complaints all came from people outside the institution. They came from outside the university. Now most of the complaints are coming from inside the institution, and mainly from students. Last week, the Brookings Institute, which is a center-left think tank located in Washington, D.C., published a survey of 1,500 American college, as they say, university students. And I want to read you a question from the poll. This is a question. A student group opposed to a speaker disrupts the speech by loudly and repeatedly shouting so that the audience cannot hear the speaker. Do you agree or disagree that the student group's actions are acceptable? 51% answered yes. A majority agreed that such behavior is acceptable. Just think about it. A majority of students believe that it's okay to silence a speaker by shouting, as long as they find what that speaker is saying to be offensive. It's pretty bad, but it actually gets worse, much worse, because here's the follow-up question. A student group is opposed to the speaker, decides to use violence to prevent the speaker from speaking. Do you agree or disagree that the student group's actions are acceptable? 19% of the respondents agreed. 1 in 5 students thinks that it is okay to use violence to silence a speaker that they disagree with. Later questions were about what sort of climate a university should have. Should it be what was labeled a positive learning environment in which certain things were not allowed to be discussed, or should it be an open learning environment in which everything is allowed to be discussed? 61% chose the first option, a positive environment where certain things can't be discussed. Now, these are American figures, and maybe it's different here in Australia, but I suspect it wouldn't be. I expect that from news stories and from things you've heard else already tonight, that we would be very similar. Moreover, I expect that if this was a poll of academics as opposed to students, the results would be pretty much the same. Right? Now, these are, as you already heard, the students that call for safe spaces and trigger warnings and who are trying to avoid challenging ideas and challenging concepts. They probably don't realize it, but they themselves challenging. They're challenging the very basis of a university, what it's actually there for, what its mission is. Universities are there for more than simply to prepare you for a career. There's nothing wrong with preparing students for a career. In fact, a good career is part of a fulfilling life. But the university's mission goes well beyond simply vocational training. The mission of a university, or at least a Western university, is actually to prepare students for citizenship in a democracy. If you think about it, democracy makes huge demands on its citizens. You can't just defer to authority as you can in a dictatorship. You've got to actually think. What do I feel about social issues? Gather the information, weigh the pros and cons, analyze it, come up with some conclusion for yourself that you will then use when you go to vote in an election or in a poll or on a jury. All those things are required of people who live in a democracy. How do you do that? Well, you'll never be able to do it unless you're exposed to ideas that are different from yours. Now, if you're not exposed to ideas that are different from yours, you never get to weigh the arguments, you never get to hear the other side. And one of the great benefits of studying in an Australian university is you get to study with people from all over the world, from different backgrounds and different groups and different ideas on social issues. In such a widely diverse group of students, you're likely to get every position available or conceivable on many issues. And debating these things, debating these topics, using logic, using evidence, actually educates students, but it does something more than that. It also enhances their mutual respect and their understanding, because when you're involved in civil and logical debate with other people, you can eventually learn that people may have different views from yours without being necessarily stupid or evil. Should have had a trigger warning for stupid, sorry. For the health of this society, for the health of our society, for the health of our future of our society, that kind of mutual respect and understanding might be the most important thing that students actually learn at university. Remember, today's university students will grow up to be tomorrow's lawyers, teachers, politicians, judges. If they believe that controversial speakers and issues are too dangerous to discuss, that view might color their decision when they move into positions of authority later in their careers. And then we must all watch out. We can't afford, therefore, to allow students to opt out. Now, one solution is to try to balance controversial speakers with those who hold different views, and this is normally good advice. In fact, that was the offer I made to my irate correspondent. Come and talk yourself, or send one of your friends who's an expert. But, and here's where I might be a bit different from others, I don't believe that balance is always possible. Sometimes it's even undesirable. And the reason for that is all ideas cannot be considered equal in a university. Otherwise, scientists would have to be teaching creationism, and philosophers would have to teach the Kabbalah, and medical deans, as I once was, would have to allow anti-vaccine people to have time in the medical course. Now, don't get me wrong. Out there in the civil society, in the world in which we live, I believe in complete freedom of speech. I believe that you should be free to say whatever you like. You can say the earth is flat. Nobody can stop you. It's a free country still. But that does not entitle you to lecture in geography at the university. There is no moral, ethical, or philosophical principle that requires a university to provide a forum for every weird and divergent idea. In a university, expertise is always a prerequisite. Universities are entitled to require that academic opinions derive from the work of competent scholars. They're entitled to insist that lecturers are fair and accurate, that they assess evidence using the accepted norms and procedures and methods of their profession. So where does that leave me? I believe that creating a climate for the civilized debate of controversial ideas is essential if the university is going to meet its mission of preparing students for democratic citizenship. However, that does not require that every conceivable viewpoint be accommodated on campus. Universities are and should remain places of learning in which respect is given to expertise, to scholarship, to skill, to accuracy, to competence, to truthfulness, and of course, to civility. And for the good of our democracy, for the good of our country, we need to do a much better job of convincing students that the best way to respond to controversial speakers and difficult ideas and challenging notions is with informed debate and not, as it seems, with censorship and violence. Thanks very much.